We're up and running again on Obsessed with Assessment podcast, the show in which we aim to peel back the mysteries of educational assessment and bring you, dear listener, the truths that lie within. My name is Sam Denno, and I am the assessment lead at Twinkl Educational Publishing. Now, I've gone on record on the show before as saying, in an ideal world, all assessment should be formative, even when it's summative. And I stand by that as a key slice of assessment mantra. However, in this episode, we're going to talk about when formative and summative testing should actually be treated differently. In particular, we're going to drill down into styles of questions. I'm very lucky to be joined by James Beadle, a senior professional development manager at the Assessment Network, which is an arm of Cambridge University Press and Assessment. Welcome to the show, James.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and your career in education up until this point?
Yeah, of course. So, firstly, I explain a little bit about the Assessment Network. And as you've said, we're part of Cambridge University Press and Assessment. And so within Cambridge Press and Assessment, there's OCR, which are a major exam board in England that I think some listeners might be aware of. There's also Cambridge International, and they offer secondary programs such as the international GCSEs and A-levels, and also primary programs, and that's outside of England and the UK. And then there's also Cambridge English and the IELTS, that the English language exams are probably what they're best known for. And we do various bits of work with governmental ministries as well. And the press is a major educational publisher. But ultimately, we're part of the University of Cambridge, and the Assessment Network. We're a small organisation that sits within this big group of people, and our role is just to provide training and assessment, and that's within both our organisation and externally. And we do a lot of work with various groups such as educational ministries internationally, other awarding bodies, but we also deliver training and assessment for both universities and schools, again, internationally and within England. And then about myself, I'm a former secondary mathematics teacher and a head of department. And again, I've worked both within England and internationally. And I've always had an interest in assessment and in particularly sort of how it impacts educational systems as a whole, through the lens of high stakes assessment. And it's something I think we're very aware of in England, but it's by no means unique to England. There are other countries with quite high stakes assessment systems that have an effect on, I would say, how then teaching and learning occurs within them.
More assessment chat on the way. On the show, we aim to spend about 10 minutes talking through the assessment-related concept before rounding off with a handful of key takeaways. James, so shoot me down. I mentioned this phrase, all assessment should be formative even when it's summative. Now, I don't suppose you disagree with that statement per se, but you might argue that it's missing some nuance.
Yeah, so the term formative refers generally to the idea that the information that we get from an assessment, we then use it to improve, if necessary, subsequent teaching. And that could be us improving it or our students taking actions to improve it, etc. And yeah, I can kind of see that idea. If you're getting information from an assessment, you're getting results, why wouldn't you use them in a formative manner? Why wouldn't you look at them and go, right, what changes, if any, do I need to make on my teaching based on these results? So yeah, in that sense, I would agree with you. But the argument I think I would make is that although all assessments can potentially be used in that formative purpose, they're not all equally suited for doing so. They're not all necessarily great at doing that. And so an example that Dylan William gives of this kind of dual purposeness is, say you've got a group of mathematics teachers who are at the same score, and they analyse all the scores obtained by their students on a national test, say the SATs in the context of England. And they find in that analysis that their students are doing less well on the topics of ratio and proportion, and so they decide to make that, as their department, their focus for professional development for the next year. And now that would definitely be a formative use, and yet that kind of assessment we probably generally view as a summative assessment. So there's that dual usage there. But what I would kind of say that if your chief purpose as a teacher, as a head of department, was to evaluate how well you were doing, your success of teaching mathematics within that year group of different topics, there's probably other ways you could have, I would say, better have done that. You could have looked at short topics tests during the year. You could have looked at comparisons of work. Even if you were trying to sort of compare how you were doing as a school to a national standard, you could have used things like age-related descriptors or past exam material that would give you an idea of how your students were doing compared to previous national cohorts. And all of those, I think, would have been a lot quicker to implement, a lot less time intensive, and would have getting you the information a lot quicker. With these kind of national tests, that's probably coming at the end of a year, so it might well be too late for those students, or you're going to have to make the changes in their next year's curriculum, which is going to create other pressures. And perhaps most importantly, that assessment itself probably doesn't actually give you a lot of information that you need. So, there might have been one or two questions on ratio and proportion. There's probably not enough about ratio and proportion in that kind of high stakes summative assessment to really help you work out exactly where bits were missing within your teaching. What went wrong where? What do we need to revisit? What do we need to look at? And indeed, there's even risks when you have that kind of scarcity of information that you might be measuring the wrong thing. So it could be, particularly in the context of ratio and proportion, that actually these were the wordiest questions on the exam paper. They had a lot of context within them. And where your students in particularly struggled was decoding that language. And that was the issue there. Ideally, we should try and make our assessments match the priority of purpose. If what I really want to know is how well do my students compare to every student nationally within that same age group, then yes, that high stakes assessment was probably the right way of doing it. But if I want to check whether they understand ratio and proportion, they are probably other easier and better ways I can do it in terms of getting the information I need.
Yeah, that adds a lot of really good context to a very broad statement. In your blog, What and Why Do We Assess in the Classroom, and I'll link that in the show notes, you give some examples of questions from the science curriculum. Can you talk us through them and describe the distinction that you make in those questions?
So this is trying to highlight that often down to the question level, some questions are probably better suited for a formative purpose and some better suited for a summative purpose. So the first question, and it is actually a past exam question, is describe and explain the conditions which lead to the development of a coral reef. And it had 7 marks allocated to it, and it's an open response question. And if you gave that, you'd likely expect from a class a range of answers, each of different lengths with different levels of understanding and information shown. And I'd say a question like that is often great for summative purposes because we're likely to get that range of responses. We can differentiate between different levels of student understanding and ability, and it's a good way of gauging, what can we see they understand on this topic and comparing them to each other. But it can be more challenging to use a question like that in a formative manner. It's going to take time for students to answer a question like that. Often rule of thumb, at least a minute per mark. So you're looking at probably allowing 10 minutes for them to answer that within perhaps a 60-minute lesson. And then as a teacher, you've got to assess those responses, which again isn't going to be quick. And perhaps I would say most importantly, a question like that with its range of responses it's likely to generate, it makes it quite challenging, I would say, for teachers to then work out what is the next step they do. If you're getting a range of responses showing a range of different kinds of understanding, how do you adapt your teaching to that? And if ultimately you feel there is a need to give individualized feedback, again, that's very time consuming and very difficult to do in a kind of a quick reactive sense within a lesson. Um, and so what I would say with that, it's not that that question can't be used formatively, particularly towards the end of the topic. You might use that as a homework and you might have the time to give individualized feedback. And you can use strategies such as self and peer assessment if you are doing it within the lesson that can help with it. But I would say it's probably not an ideal formative question, particularly if I just want to do a quick check. Do you know this thing about coral reefs? It's a very time consuming way of doing that. The other question that we look at within that blog is a multiple choice question. The question is as follows: which one of the following is a required condition for coral reefs to form? And then there's 4 possible choices. And the interesting thing about this question is that each response if a student picks it, tells us something different. So the response A, a minimum water temperature of 30 degrees, that's incorrect. That will kill most coral. That's why climate change is a big issue for coral. And so if a student is picking that, there's a big misconception there. They've probably identified 30 degrees. I heard that in a lesson before, but they haven't remembered the correct information surrounded by that. And, really something we'd want to very quickly address as a teacher. And I think probably, be quite worried about it if that was the common response by our students. We'd likely want to go back towards the start. B, a clean supply of fresh water, is a bit of a meaner option there to have. So corals do like clean water. They're not keen on pollution, but they need salt water, not fresh water. So there's almost a little bit of semantics there. We're teasing out the difference of the words there. So again, if students pick B, there is a misconception there that they haven't perhaps keyed out that key bit about fresh water versus salt water, but there is also some understanding there. They know that there is a clean supply of water needed, that the cleanliness of water is important. And so I'm probably, as a teacher, less worried about a student who picks option B than option A, because there is some knowledge there that is useful. There's a different kind of misconception there, rather than perhaps just a lack of understanding. You can also begin to see why I might not want to use this question in a summative sense, because I'm almost trying to catch a student out. Both anyone who picks A or B has gotten it wrong, but there's different levels of knowledge shown there that I'm not appropriately crediting. It's not actually helping me order the students by the knowledge they're showing. If we keep on looking at the options, option C, abundant nutrients such as plankton, that's the correct answer. Select that, you're happy. And then option D, ample light for the coral to photosynthesize. That one is, I would say, really, really mean. So coral do need light for photosynthesis to occur, but it's not the coral that photosynthesize, it's an algae that they have a symbiotic relationship with. And so again, a student who picks D, they do probably remember something quite important relating to the topic, that corals need light and that corals have a relationship with photosynthesis, but there's just a little bit of technical information there that they haven't quite remembered. And again, you can really see in a summative sense, we probably wouldn't want to answer that question. It's not designed to fairly distinguish between those who have knowledge and don't, but it's a great question in a formative sense in terms of working out next steps for my teaching. Is there that little bit of knowledge there that my students don't have that I want to give them? And I think another good sign of where, these questions are really powerful formative questions is where, as a teacher, you can almost anticipate the different kinds of discussions you're going to have after them. If students pick option D, or some of your students probably would pick option D, they're going to think it's unfair. But hopefully, it's formative, it's low stakes. You're going to get a couple of low moans or grumbles. They're not going to be upset about it. And that leads into a discussion about, well, why was it incorrect? Yeah, okay, I got you. I was a bit mean there. And that in itself is likely going to be memorable and help them retain that information. Whereas if it was used in a summative, sense, they probably would feel quite strongly that it was unfair and have quite a visceral emotional reaction to it, and likely disengage from any feedback or anything like that.
So you recommend, therefore, that a teacher, when they're planning their formative questions in the classroom, if they're using multiple choice, that they do go through very, very carefully and think about not just the question but the answers as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think with any multiple choice question, whether formative or summative in terms of the purpose, that the hardest bit is getting what we would call the distractors, the incorrect answers, because they need to be plausible. Otherwise, it's too easy. So there needs to be a reason why students would pick them. And that's often quite difficult to come up with. Obviously we know what the correct answer is, but what's a believable incorrect answer? And then, if you're using them, as a diagnostic sense or a formative purpose, you really want them to highlight potential misconceptions. And so you can almost think, right, if my students pick this wrong answer, this is what I need to correct in my teaching. That this is the lack of understanding it highlights, and ideally each different distractor highlights a different area, and then you know exactly who needs what kind of feedback.
The way you've sort of gone into those multiple choices and broken that down sort of diagnostically is really, really helpful.
One thing I should recommend is if you are interested in these kinds of questions, Craig Barton is a very big proponent of these and does have a website called diagnosticquestions.com, which is free to use and has a whole bank. So, full credit to him. That's where I first came across these when I was a teacher. And yeah, I think they can be great for formative assessment within lessons.
In terms of key takeaways, most teachers will be working with formative assessment in the day-to-day. What do they need to consider when they're planning their lessons?
So I think the first key takeaway I'd say is really just consider the priority of your purpose. And if it's, the purpose is assessment for learning, so your chief aim is formative, then how are your students going to adapt the next stages of teaching and learning if necessary? What are those next steps going to look like? And then, okay, if those are the likely next steps, what information do you need that assessment to give you? What misconceptions does it need to highlight? And ideally, I would say, if it's happening within your lessons, you want to get that information as quickly as possible so you can adapt your teaching as quickly as possible. If that information comes a week or two later, you may have moved on from that. You may be trying to build on that knowledge. In a lot of scenarios, that's unfortunately probably too late. So an example I'd give, if for example your aim within a lesson is maybe to see if students can write a strong conclusion to an essay, you might expect them to consider multiple sides of the arguments and then come down to one definitive point of view. That could perhaps be assessed by giving them a piece of work that was missing a conclusion and asking them to write it, rather than expecting them to write an entire essay. Or even you could look at having them comparing and contrasting different conclusions that you provide to them, and then ask them to explain why one might be stronger than the other. All those kinds of forms of assessments are probably more likely to match that priority of purpose, whereas that big getting them to write an essay is probably not actually doing what you need it to do, or isn't the best way of doing what you need it to do. And then the second key takeaway, I would say, and this probably goes broader than just teachers, but I would say that ultimately we probably need to accept that often the best forms of formative assessments, ones that are very effective within the classroom, don't necessarily leave a lot of traditional evidence behind them, such as written marker, that someone can come along a day or a week later and see that formative assessment was done. If my class is working on mini whiteboards, that disappears very quickly. But that's kind of what we expect. The whole aim of this effective formative assessment often is that teachers are focusing on adapting their next stage of teaching, of responding to the learners, rather than necessarily recording evidence. The evidence we see when this is working is that students are making effective progress over time, and that's probably what we need to focus on, rather than necessarily trying to see the evidence that assessment had occurred.
This has been deeply insightful, James. Thanks so much for joining us to share your wisdom. We love to hear listener ideas and questions, and you can drop us a message at assessment@twinkl.co.uk. Please like and subscribe to the podcast. You can find me on Blue Sky and LinkedIn as Sam Denno. James, can you be reached anywhere?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's James Beadle. If you put in Cambridge Assessment, you'll definitely find me. And you can also find the Assessment Network. Again, that's on LinkedIn. They are also on X, and we do have a web page you can contact us through as well.
Thanks for listening, everybody, and goodbye for now.